Welcome to today's deep dive. Before we really jump into things, I just want to warmly welcome you and offer a divine blessing for your day and for your entire week ahead. May you find inspiration, peace, and clarity in whatever you are setting out to do today.
That's a wonderful way to start.
Thanks. So I want you to imagine for a second that you are handed a blank piece of parchment, and you're tasked with writing the origin story for everything.
Oh, wow. Everything.
Literally everything. Not just your nation, but the universe, the planet, plants and animals, the genesis of human families, the first murder, the invention of industry, and even the introduction of death itself.
That is a completely monumental task.
Right. But that is the precise scope of the book of Genesis, and that is the mission of our deep dive today.
It really is a breathtaking project when you step back from just how familiar it is to so many of us.
Yeah, exactly. We're exploring this foundational text, and we're pulling primarily from the introductory insights of two really comprehensive sources today, the Holman and the NAA Study Bibles.
And I think our main goal here is to push past the usual modern cultural debates that just tend to dominate conversations around this book.
Yes, 100%. We want to look closely at the literary, historical, and theological architecture of the text. Because Genesis isn't just an old book. It's a highly sophisticated, deeply radical narrative that actually altered the trajectory of human history.
And to really grasp how radical it is, I mean, we have to strip away our 21st century assumptions.
Which is hard to do.
Very hard. We need to evaluate the text within its own ancient Near Eastern neighborhood, so to speak, rather than, holding it to the standards of modern historical or scientific documentation.
So let's start with the title itself right off the bat, because it sets up an interesting dynamic. The English-speaking world knows it as Genesis.
Right, which comes from the Greek Septuagint translation meaning origins.
Exactly, but the original Hebrew title is Bereshith, which simply means, in the beginning. It's taken directly from the very first words of the scroll.
It's a subtle difference, but it's important. It frames the book less as like a scientific textbook of origins, and more as the opening scene of a continuous historical drama.
I love that. And right at that opening scene, we hit one of the most heavily debated topics in biblical scholarship, which is authorship.
Ah, yes. The authorship mystery.
Traditionally, both Jewish and Christian history attribute the Pentateuch, the first 5 books, to Moses, grounding the text in that 2nd millennium BC aristocratic Egyptian context.
But as anyone familiar with biblical studies knows, critical scholars in the 19th and 20th centuries really pushed back heavily on that.
Right, with the documentary hypothesis and later critical frameworks.
Exactly. They argued that Genesis was actually a patchwork compilation of various sources, perhaps reaching its final edited form around the post-exilic period, so maybe the 5th century BC.
So how do the Holman and NAA Study Bibles navigate that tension? Because it often feels like an all-or-nothing debate in academic circles. You either believe Moses wrote every single word or it was completely invented 1,000 years later.
They actually provide a very nuanced middle ground. They look strictly at the internal evidence.
What do they find?
Well, on one side of the ledger, the cultural footprint of Genesis is undeniably ancient. When you look at the patriarchal narratives...
Like Abraham, Isaac, Jacob?
Right. When you look at their marriage customs, the specific laws regarding inheritance, the fluctuating prices of slaves, even the structure of ancient treaties, they perfectly match what archaeologists have uncovered about the 2nd millennium BC, roughly 1500 to 1300 BC or even earlier.
So a later writer couldn't have faked that.
Exactly. A post-exilic author living in the 5th century simply wouldn't have known those highly specific, archaic cultural details.
But on the other side of the ledger, there are anomalies in the text. For instance, in Genesis chapter 14, the text casually mentions the city of Dan.
Which is a classic example.
Yeah, historically we know that city was called Laishih. It wasn't actually renamed Dan until the period of the Judges, which is centuries after Moses. So does the presence of later geographical names undermine the ancient core of the text for these scholars?
Not at all. The study notes treat this as evidence of careful, subtle, editorial updating by later scribes.
Okay, how so?
Think of it like finding an authentic ancient map from the 1600s. But a later curator has carefully penciled in the modern name of a highway just so contemporary readers wouldn't get completely lost.
Oh, that makes so much sense.
Yeah, the ancient scribes updated archaic place names and smoothed out obscure language specifically to preserve the text's usability for later generations of Israelites.
It demonstrates that the text was a living document. Fiercely protected, but carefully curated.
Exactly. And that editorial curation makes total sense when you consider what Genesis was actively trying to achieve in its original context. It wasn't written in a vacuum.
Right. It was written as a highly intentional polemic against the surrounding cultures,
Yeah.
a counter-argument.
It is the ultimate counterculture narrative of the ancient world. If you look at the competing creation myths of the ancient Near East, like the Mesopotamian epics of Gilgamesh, Atrahasis, or the Enuma Elish, the worldview is utterly chaotic.
I mean, in the Enuma Elish, the physical universe is created out of the literal dismembered corpse of a defeated sea goddess, Tiamat.
It's brutal. The gods are petty, they go to war, they deceive one another.
And the creation of humanity in those myths is incredibly grim, too. In the Atrahasis epic, the lesser gods basically go on a labor strike because digging irrigation canals is too much work.
So they just quit.
Yeah, they quit. So the chief gods slaughter a rebel god, mix his blood with clay, and create humans solely to be a slave class so the gods can finally get some sleep.
That is the cultural air the original audience of Genesis was breathing. That was the dominant narrative.
And then you contrast that with Genesis chapter 1.
It's night and day. You don't have divine war.
Yeah.
You don't have God struggling with pre-existing violent matter.
You have Elohim.
Yes, one sovereign God who brings the entire cosmos into existence ex nihilo out of nothing, purely through the order of his spoken word. He doesn't need sleep, and he certainly doesn't need slave labor.
It completely flips the ontological script. Humans aren't an afterthought made from the blood of a murdered deity. They are the apex of creation, intentionally designed to rule as living representatives of a benevolent creator.
Which is why the structure of the book is so important.
Yeah.
The author had to organize this radical new worldview in a way that the audience could internalize.
And the study Bibles break that macrostructure of Genesis down into two distinct halves: primeval history and patriarchal history.
Right. Chapters 1 through 11 cover the primeval history. This is the grand, universal stage.
Creation, the fall of humanity, the catastrophic flood, the scattering at the Tower of Babel.
Then, at chapter 12, there is a massive pivot. The patriarchal history takes over from chapter 12 all the way to 50, and the narrative suddenly narrows down to the incredibly specific multi-generational story of one family, starting with Abraham.
And the literary hinge that connects these two massive halves is really fascinating. It essentially structures the entire book. It's a repeating Hebrew phrase, Toledah.
Usually translated as these are the generations of, or this is the history of.
Right. It appears 11 times throughout the text. It marks the transitions from the heavens and the earth to Adam, to Noah, the sons of Noah, Shem, Terah, Ishmael, Isaac, Esau, and finally, Jacob.
The study notes describe that phrase as acting like a camera's magnifying glass.
I love that analogy.
It works so well. The narrative starts with an expansive, wide shot of the entire cosmos. Then it pans down to the earth, then to humanity as a whole. And with each use of that Toledah formula, the lens zooms in tighter and tighter.
Ruthlessly stripping away the periphery to focus exactly on who God is working with.
It's a brilliant literary device.
Yeah.
But it brings us to a structural element that modern readers almost universally struggle with.
The genealogies.
Genealogies.
I will be the first to admit, when I hit chapter 5 and it's just a wall of so-and-so lived this many years and begot so-and-so, my eyes tend to glaze over. It feels like an ancient phone book.
Most people feel that way today.
So what are the study notes seeing in these genealogies that the average reader is missing?
They see the essential skeleton of the narrative. We have to remember that in an oral-dominant ancient culture, genealogies weren't filler. They were the structural spine of history.
Right.
And the author of Genesis uses two very distinct types of genealogies to control the pace of the story: linear and segmented.
Break down the difference for us. How does a linear genealogy function?
A linear genealogy moves straight down the line from point A to point B. Think of the lineage stretching from Adam down to Noah in chapter 5, which spans 10 generations.
It traces the primary unbroken trajectory of history.
Exactly. It shows the reader the exact family line that carries the promise forward. It's the central nervous system of the narrative.
And the segmented genealogies. The study materials refer to these as the dead ends, which sounds a bit harsh for biblical characters.
It's not a moral judgment, it's just a narrative function. A segmented genealogy branches out horizontally. It covers several siblings or cousins in a single generation, but it only lasts for a brief moment in the text.
So it's used for figures who are outside the chosen line of promise, like Ishmael or Esau.
Right. The author gives you a quick, comprehensive rundown of their descendants, like the 12 princes of Ishmael or the chiefs of Edom. It honors their historical reality and explains the origins of Israel's neighbors.
But then it abruptly stops.
Exactly. Functionally, it's a cinematic tool used to sweep the stage. It ties off loose historical ends and politely dismisses those characters from the narrative focus.
So once the stage is cleared, the author can laser focus right back onto the main family line of Isaac and Jacob.
Once you recognize that mechanical function, those lists of names suddenly reveal the author's incredibly tight grip on the story's direction. It's not random at all.
That makes a lot of sense. And if we have to shift our expectations away from modern sensibilities to appreciate the genealogies, it seems we have to do the exact same thing when it comes to the intersection of Genesis and science.
Without question. This is arguably the biggest friction point for contemporary readers.
When we approach the opening chapters of Genesis with the expectations of a 21st century post-Enlightenment scientific method, we end up interrogating the text with questions it simply doesn't possess the vocabulary or the intent to answer.
The Holman and NAA notes are very clear on this.
Yeah.
Genesis is a theological history. It is not a modern science textbook.
We have to continually anchor ourselves in the original audience. This text was delivered to a community of Israelites who had just left Egypt and were wandering in the Sinai desert.
Surrounded by Egyptian pantheism in their rearview mirror and Canaanite fertility cults ahead of them.
They didn't need a lesson on biological taxonomy or the formation of sedimentary rock. They desperately needed ontological coordinates. They needed to know the identity and character of the God who had just pulled them out of slavery.
And that focus completely dictates how the text is constructed. A perfect example is the fierce debate over the days of creation in chapter 1. The study sources point out that faithful, rigorous scholars have interpreted these days in several distinct ways, precisely because the text focuses on theology rather than scientific mechanics.
We're all familiar with the literal 24-hour calendar day interpretation, and many readers look at it through the day-age theory, viewing the days as vast geological epochs.
But the study Bibles also highlight a fascinating approach called the literary framework view.
Can you unpack how that actually works in the text?
Sure. The literary framework view argues that the author organized the creation account topically, not strictly chronologically, to emphasize God bringing order out of chaos.
Okay.
The initial state of the earth in verse 2 is described as formless and void. So the first 3 days are about God creating form. He separates light from darkness on day 1, separates the sky and sea on day 2, and separates dry land from the sea on day 3.
He builds the architecture.
Exactly. Then days 4, 5, and 6 are about filling that void. Day 4 fills the light and dark domains of day 1 with the sun, moon, and stars.
Day 5 fills the sky and sea domains of day 2 with birds and fish.
And day 6 fills the dry land of day 3 with animals and humanity. It is a highly stylized, poetic structure designed to show God systematically conquering chaos with divine symmetry.
That drastically shifts the reading experience. The text is entirely silent on the physics of how light was separated from darkness, because the physics aren't the point.
The point is establishing a worldview where God is supremely sovereign. He is outside of creation, and everything he makes is inherently purposefully good.
And that same theological primacy applies to the narrative of the flood.
Absolutely.
The study notes acknowledge that the flood represents a real catastrophic historical judgment. But when modern readers obsess over trying to map the biblical account perfectly onto global geological strata, or spend all their energy calculating the exact displacement of the ark's dimensions,
Just to prove a scientific point.
right, they are missing the forest for the trees, because the author's primary focus in chapters 6 through 9 is deeply moral. It's an account of decreation and recreation.
The flood narrative is a profound commentary on the absolute corruption of human nature, God's righteous grief over that violence, and his miraculous preservation of humanity through a remnant.
If we treat it purely as a meteorological data set, we completely bypass the devastating tragedy of the human condition that the author is desperately trying to communicate.
And that human condition is the core drama of the entire book.
Let's dig into that paradox, because Genesis paints an incredibly complex, somewhat agonizing picture of who we are.
It's a paradox that defines the rest of the Bible. On one hand, humanity is elevated above the rest of the created order. Men and women are uniquely made in the imago Dei, the image of God.
In the ancient Near East, conquering kings would place physical statues of themselves in subjugated territories to represent their authority.
Genesis democratizes that concept. Humans are the living, breathing statues of God in the temple of creation.
They are appointed as his vice-regents, given the mandate to cultivate the earth and rule as representatives of God's goodness. It is an incredibly high, dignified calling.
But the tragedy is that almost the moment they are placed in this perfect environment, they rebel.
They listen to the serpent, they become suspicious of God's motives, and they decide to seize the autonomy to define good and evil for themselves.
And the fallout of that autonomy is catastrophic. What the study sources highlight, which is so refreshing, is the sheer, raw honesty of Genesis.
It doesn't romanticize its heroes.
Not at all. It doesn't hide the brutal realities of human sin. It meticulously documents how that initial rebellion in the garden infects every level of human interaction, especially the family unit.
The family trauma in this book is staggering. We tend to sanitize these stories in Sunday school, but the reality is brutally dysfunctional. Just one generation outside of Eden, you have Cain murdering his brother Abel out of pure, unchecked jealousy.
And that familial fracture just compounds. Look at the patriarchs. You have favoritism tearing Isaac's family apart.
Jacob actively schemes to exploit his brother Esau's hunger to steal his birthright, and then dresses in goat skins to deceive his blind father and steal the blessing.
Then Jacob's own family is arguably worse. His sons harbor so much toxic resentment toward their brother Joseph that they throw him into a dry cistern, debate murdering him, and settle for selling him into Egyptian slavery.
And then lied to their father about it for decades. These are the foundational heroes of the faith, acting with profound deceit and cowardice.
Which brings up a critical theological question. Why would the author highlight all this horrific dysfunction? Why not gloss over the moral failures of the patriarchs to make the origins of Israel look better to the surrounding nations?
Because the text is making a point about who the actual hero is. If Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph are deeply flawed, it leaves only one candidate for the hero of the narrative.
Precisely. The hero of Genesis is God. God is the subject of the very first verb in the book, and he remains the unifying thread holding all this chaos together. And he does this through the mechanism of covenant.
The covenant is the anchor of the entire patriarchal history. Despite all the human failure, the deceit, and the brother-against-brother betrayals, God unilaterally steps into the mess.
We see the seeds of it right after the fall in Eden, with the prophetic promise that the seed of the woman will eventually crush the serpent's head.
But it crystallizes in chapter 12 when God calls Abraham out of pagan Mesopotamia and makes an astonishing, unprompted promise. He promises Abraham land, a multitude of descendants, and most crucially, that through this specific, deeply imperfect family line, all the nations of the earth will ultimately be blessed.
It's a massive shift in perspective. If God's plan relies on his own unyielding faithfulness rather than human perfection, that fundamentally changes how the ancient Israelites would have viewed their own failures in the wilderness.
It shows that God is initiating a global rescue operation, and he is choosing to execute it through a family that continually proves they don't deserve it.
That is the essential bedrock that our study sources want us to walk away with today.
Genesis is not just a collection of ancient myths, and it's certainly not a dusty list of genealogies to be skipped over. It masterfully sets up the grand problem of human exile, the fracturing of our relationship with the Creator and with each other through sin.
And simultaneously, it initiates the grand solution, planting the theological seeds of redemption through a chosen, flawed family line that will culminate in the rest of the biblical narrative.
It diagnoses the human condition with brutal accuracy, while offering profound, historically grounded hope.
And it remains compelling because the underlying realities of human nature, our propensity for chaos, and our desperate need for order and grace haven't changed.
Before we wrap up this deep dive, we want to leave you with a final thought to mull over.
Consider the original audience again. The ancient Israelites, standing in the desert, desperately needed Genesis. They needed a true origin story to give them an identity in a world saturated with competing, chaotic myths that devalued human life. They needed to know exactly who they were and who their God was.
And today, we live in an age of intense information overload. We are constantly bombarded by competing worldviews, ideologies, and cultural narratives trying to define human value and origin.
So what is the core origin story you rely on to make sense of your place in the universe?
That is a profound question to carry with you. Thank you for joining us as we unpacked the monumental structure and theology of the book of Genesis. We hope this deep dive has provided you with a richer, more nuanced perspective on this ancient masterpiece. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and God bless all the listeners.